Guibh go léir a cóide agus tá fáilte rót. Welcome to Be My Guest with me, Mary Honan, on Lear Media TV, supporting the Samaritans, Limerick and Tipperary, and also Clare's Wish Foundation. Now, I'm truly honoured, it has to be said, to have my next guest on today, and she is Gillian Walnes, Perry, MBE. I'm not sure, Gillian, should I be curtsying to you?
Of course.
Take it as a given. Just that I've curtsied. But we'll start with that. Was it an absolutely true honour to receive an MBE from the Queen? And was it the Queen that actually...
It was actually the Prince of Wales. The Queen does less and less now, of course, because it's a lot of standing on your feet to do an investiture. And I think I think that Queen very rarely does them. But it was, of course, a real honour. And I dedicated it to all my colleagues who had helped build the trust into the organisation that it has become.
And it should be said that you were honoured for your work in Holocaust education, and yes. I suppose specifically for your passion, your lifelong passion with telling Anne Frank's story, and trying to use Anne Frank's story to benefit young people. Yes. And so, how, Gillian, did you become interested and so involved in the story of Anne Frank? I mean, I've touched on it in my research and it's an absolutely, utterly fascinating book for anyone to write, least of all against a backdrop of immense terror and uncertainty. And I suppose nowadays with COVID, we're very conscious of being cloistered and being in our homes and almost going stir crazy. Can one imagine what it must have been like for a child, knowing that if she stepped out, there was the danger she was going to be, one, taken from her family, and two, killed?
Do you know, it's very interesting you say that, Mary, because, you know, we're all getting very fed up and very frustrated of being isolated. We're social animals, after all. And, you know, what keeps me grounded, and I keep reminding my husband, I remind my family, I remind my friends, my mantra over the last few months has been, but there are no Nazis outside the door. Yes, there is a killer disease and we don't know where it is lurking and looming. And sadly, it's put us on our guard against normal social interactions. If you're walking down the street, you don't actually automatically smile and say hello to people as you pass. You try and avoid them. It's turned us into different animals, but there are no Nazis outside the door. And Anne wrote so vividly and so poignantly about her fears of what could happen to them if they were betrayed and arrested. And ironically, Mary, it was those last few weeks of their hiding, which was the summer of 1944, when she had written in her diary on June the 6th, D-Day, this is the day, I feel that friends are on their way.
I know, there was always hope.
Yes, the hope was really, among those 8 people in hiding together in Amsterdam, the hope was rising throughout that summer that they were soon going to be liberated and that Anne actually could go back to school, which actually for a girl who was quite naughty sometimes in class and quite disruptive and often in trouble with her teachers, precocious and chatty in class, this was quite a thing. She missed school. She realized that the things that she had taken so much for granted when she was on the outside world and her normal life before hiding, like playing with her friends, going to school, etc., having her activities and hobbies, those were things that were stripped away from her. And the things that then became important to her in those 2 very long years of hiding were writing, because she felt she had a gift and that she wanted to be a published writer after liberation, after the war had finished. And also something that she speaks about very openly and honestly, that she had never appreciated nature when she had been on the outside world. And she writes beautifully about how much seeing the moon and the stars and the treetops. And remember, she only had a very limited view of a little attic window at the top of the dusty old attic. She could see the top of the tree, the chestnut tree outside, and she could see the seasons changing through that tree. And she writes so beautifully about what that meant to her. These things became very, very important. And over the last few months, I've done a lot of lecturing on Zoom all around the world. I've managed to get
our whole lives have gone on Zoom.
Yes, all around the world from my dining room table.
You like that? Do you like that?
I actually love it.
Or do you miss the physicality of being around people?
I actually love both. I think this interaction with someone like yourself has absolutely saved my life this last few months. And actually, conversely, some of the organizations and groups that I've spoken to around the world, whether they've been in Sydney or Toronto or California, where I had to get up at 5:30 in the morning to do a lecture because I was the keynote speaker at night in California, or midnight. I've got one coming up in midnight.
Midnight I can cope with. I'm a night owl. Midnight I could cope with. 1:30 in the morning. I'd get up, but it would be under duress.
Well, I got up, I did put my face on, I wasn't wearing my pajamas, I did actually get dressed to do it. But people have said to me, and particularly some of the groups that I speak to around the UK, that say for us, even when we go back to the normal world, we will still continue to have occasional Zoom lectures because we're getting speakers that we wouldn't normally get.
Yeah.
That wouldn't normally travel this distance. Well, we wouldn't really, pay for them to travel this distance. So it's been great. And I've met some wonderful people like yourself. People have cropped up through the number of lectures I've been doing that one wouldn't normally have the opportunity of meeting so many people.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
It is an amazing, it is amazing that Zoom has actually come up for us. Because can you just imagine what it would be like? I'm sure, as certainly creative people will find a way for their creativity to come out. I mean, I see lots of my friends. I graduated from art college before I went back to do English literature. So you tend to, being an only child, you tend to be able to find things to do, ways to create, ways to do things.
Because you all have to do it for yourself anyway.
Ways to keep normal and keep sane. And I wonder with Anne, for instance, in this situation, was the fact that was that what was keeping her going? Because she had this utter belief, even to the very end, before she was captured, that people were generally good and that things would get better, and that the world would be a happier place. And it never did really for her, but yet in some strange sort of a way, Anne's voice became almost bigger than it ever would have been probably in her lifetime because of what happened to her.
Yeah, it's a tragic thing. And I always say, though, the diary has had a huge impact on people and continues to do so. But at the end of the day, we would have preferred to have Anne.
Of course, Anne knows what she could have done by now. Exactly. Her life could have taken so many paths, and she could have impacted so many on a personal level, on a physical level. She could have had a family, had children, had a life. Yes. All that taken from her by at the hands of madmen. Well, we say madmen, but most of them, I mean, I saw a quote one time saying, with the exception of a few, most were ordinary men. Most dangerous are the functionaries, ready and willing to do everything they're asked without question. We give them credit by saying, oh, they were insane or they were evil. Most of them were ordinary people, and it's within all of us to do exactly the same thing given the wrong or right set of
Exactly, and people
circumstances.
forget that members of the killing squads that went out into Eastern Europe, into Russia and Ukraine, etc. Some of these were very eminent people, and the people that went along with the ideology of Nazism were judges, they were doctors, they were teachers. So these were professional, educated people that made that choice to uphold this ideology and implement
and family men and women who were
absolutely. Men and women. Hitler was an animal lover, so it's a complete.
And an artist. One would have to I heard somebody say one day, if only he had got into college, could things have been different had he not been.
They well have done. They may well have been very different. Exactly. But it's interesting what you say, trying to visualize what Anne Frank's life could have been. Look, the truth is we'll never know, but she may have been a writer. She may have changed her mind and gone into a completely different field. How the experience of being in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen would have changed her mentally and her outlook on life, we do not know. But what we do know is that her father, Otto Frank, despite having barely survived Auschwitz. If he hadn't been liberated on the 27th of January, a couple of weeks later, he wouldn't have made it. He was in the camp, he was in the hospitals trying to hold on to life. But despite everything that had happened to him and the destruction of his own family, he still believed in the power of education and bringing people together. And when he read Anne's diary, he really admitted that he'd never truly known his daughter, who he had lived with 24/7 for those last 2 years. They were never out of each other's company. But he didn't know her hidden depths. I mean, we can say this about a lot of our teenage children. We don't know actually what's really going on in their minds. We just see the superficial,
what people want you to see.
Yes, you see the precociousness, the answering back, the grumpiness, etc. But there were hidden depths to his daughter that he really didn't know. And he was so profoundly affected by this. And of course, the loss of his wife and his other daughter, who was immensely talented girl as well. And unfortunately, she is so much overshadowed by...
Completely overshadowed in many senses by Anne, sadly.
Yes, but Otto, he made an incredible choice in life when he read the diary. When he read the diary, he still didn't, he had a very great moral dilemma because he didn't know what to do with it, because he knew that his daughter had desperately wanted to be a published writer. But in her diary, she was very critical of particularly her mother. There was a lot of sibling rivalry going on, and she was very intolerant of the other adults in hiding with them, who were friends of her parents. And so he wanted to protect the reputations, if you like, of the other 7 people, of people in hiding who had been killed so terribly. And it
is a dilemma. Does one?
What's the dilemma? Do I publish this or not? Eventually, I mean, he showed the diary to a few of his trusted friends for an opinion. Some said, forget it, no one's going to want to read it. Others, like his literary critic friend, Jan Romain, said everybody should read this diary as a testament to what people have suffered and what was lost. And he actually, Jan Romain, published an article which was printed on the front page of the local newspaper, Het Parool, saying everyone should read this voice of a child. And because of that, a publisher came forward. It was a Catholic publisher called Contact, and they agreed to publish the diary in a limited run of 1,500 copies to see how it would be received, because the Dutch, of course, they really wanted to move on from the horrors of the war and then move forward. And so it was published, but in that first publication, 1/3 of the diary was actually left out. The parts that Otto felt he didn't want to see published, which were very critical of the other people in hiding, and the parts that the Catholic publishers felt were not suitable reading for people at the time, because she was very frank and candid
But,
about the transition that she was going through. You know, she was transitioning from a
but
child.
she was also thinking that she was, in some respects, um, giving her diary the name Kitty.
Yeah.
She almost humanized the diary. So in her way, she was having a conversation with a secret friend,
Yes,
a human being. It was no longer a piece of paper. It was no longer an inanimate object. It was a human being that she was talking to. And as she said herself, nobody understands me. I can't tell people how I feel because I always say the wrong things. And in many respects, I can understand that. I prefer writing because I feel sometimes when you write, you can look at it and you can say, no, that's not what I meant. And I'll rephrase it.
Yeah.
You're never in danger of being misunderstood when you put it in writing. So she always felt Kitty, or her diary, was the only one who really understood her, and the only one she could really secretly tell her most inner thoughts to, certainly about Peter, and about her sister, and about her mother. And her mother, she felt, never understood her.
Yes, I always say that thank goodness my daughter didn't have a diary when she was, keep a diary when she was a teenager that was published, you know, teenagers, eh? But yes, she did pour out everything, which possibly was very unusual at the time for, you know, a well brought up German-born girl. And this is why young people have so identified with the diary. You know, in the 1950s and 60s, there was this incredible phenomenon as the diary was being published around the world and more people were reading it. And of course, in those days, young people didn't feel that they could open up to their own parents or their teachers like they do now. So because of how she wrote about her father in the diary, that he was a liberal-minded, he was a worldly man. He'd actually worked in America for a little while.
Yeah.
So he was an unusually liberal-minded man. And because of how she described him in her diary, young people would actually write letters to Mr. Frank from all over the world. And every single letter that he received, he was like a universal agony aunt. He would answer, giving young people advice, telling them how to do things properly. And it was quite an incredible phenomenon. Now, a couple of years ago, I was giving a lecture in a library in New York, and a woman came up to me and she said, Gillian, I've got something to show you. And she had not one, but two letters from Otto Frank. And as a teenager in the 1970s, she had also felt compelled to write to Mr. Frank when she read Anne's diary. And so she wrote him a letter, and he responded and thanked her for the letter and wrote a few things to her. And as a well-brought-up young girl, she actually wrote back to him to thank him for the letter. And lo and behold, she got another letter back from him. So these were very, very precious items for her that she brought along to show me. Two letters from Otto Frank. Now, remember, he wasn't working on a word processor like we do now.
No.
Typewriter, ably assisted by his second wife, Fritzi, the mother of Eva Schloss, who are you?
Schloss. I'm hoping to have Eva.
Yes, you're hoping to speak to her, I know.
Hoping I can get Eva Schloss.
Oh, you will, I'm sure you will.
Hoping. Yeah, she'd be amazing to talk to.
Yes.
She'd bring a completely different dynamic again of being the daughter of Otto Frank. Do you know?
Stepdaughter, yes. Well, she was very close to Otto.
Okay.
And she was, of course, very close to her own father and her own adored older brother. And really, she has, since she's been speaking about her experiences, which didn't really happen till the mid-1980s, when she was at the launch of the very first Anne Frank exhibition in the UK.
Yeah.
And she actually opened up on that occasion, and her own husband and daughters didn't know her story until she spoke on that occasion.
Isn't it amazing the amount of people I've spoken to, the amount of Holocaust survivors I've spoken to? Some of them spoke about it all the way through and had no problems talking. Well, they wanted to tell the story. Many of them didn't talk about it till they were retired from
That's
their
right.
jobs. Their wives knew nothing. I mean, we had two survivors here in Ireland, Zoltan Collis, who was 4 when he was released from Bergen-Belsen, and he had TB of the spine, and he was the first Irishman child to ever have penicillin tested on, because Alexander Fleming was in the UK at the time. And the man who adopted Zoltan was the medical liberator of Bergen-Belsen, Dr. Bob Collis, who founded the Cerebral Palsy Clinic. But he adopted Zoltan and his sister Edith, and they lived next door to each other all their lives in Ireland, and they died within a week of each other. She promised her mother as they were leaving Belsen, her mother died, and made her promise she'd look after Zoltan, and she died a week after him.
Wow.
Of heartbreak. But yeah, and now we have Tommy Reichenthal. I'm sure you might know Tommy, but
yes,
he's none of them spoke about the Holocaust till they were well retired, before they started speaking about their experiences.
I think it was a surviving mechanism, Mary, because so many of it's very rare that survivors actually started telling their stories immediately, because I don't think the world was receptive. Remember, in that post-war period, there were a lot of sort of issues happening. Of course, in Britain, we had the introduction of the welfare state, and getting, there was still rationing, there was still conscription. And so the 1950s was not really the environment for people wanting to hear these stories. They wanted to just move forward from the war. And so many of the survivors I've met, they literally sort of locked that door in their brain of memory and moved forward with their lives. In fact, I'm writing a piece for an academic resource at the moment in America about survivors and about how they've coped and what they've actually given back to society. Because I think as much as learning about the atrocities of the Holocaust and what people actually suffered, for young people to learn about the post-war survival period and how these people rebuilt their lives. They married, they had families, they brought up children, they studied, they started businesses, they learned professions, and in some cases even became philanthropists in later life and gave back to the society that.
And it's peculiar as well how people like, say, Tommy Reichenthal went back to Germany. After the war, they went back and he trained as an engineer, and then he moved to Israel, and then he moved to Israel and then to Germany to train as an engineer, and then to the UK, and then to Ireland. And that's what I think these shows are about, is trying to go beyond the Holocaust, to bring the Holocaust with us, to tell their stories, but also to show that they have, this is what they have become. These are the people they've become, and these are the lives they've lived. And in many respects, they're a testament to survival. And they've defeated, if you like, hate, because of the families they've gone on to have and the lives they've gone on to live.
Yes. And I think actually Otto Frank and Anne's father is a particularly shining example of this, because when he had the diary published, his vision was that it would become a force for good, that he could use this as a tool for force for good, so that other young people wouldn't have to suffer in the same way that his own daughters had. And when he actually opened the Anne Frank House in 1960, a little bit of background to that was that the Anne Frank House, the hiding place, was a 17th century typical Dutch merchant's building. And that whole area around the house, the hiding place, was becoming derelict by the late 1950s because it was so old. Now, in those days, in the 60s, the plan was to knock all this sort of historic architecture down and completely start again. Nowadays, of course, that wouldn't happen. It was all preserved. But they were going to knock that area down. And so Otto went with a group of friends to see the mayor of Amsterdam, prevailed upon him to preserve the hiding place, because people were already coming to see it on pilgrimages to see where Anne Frank had hidden. And the mayor of Amsterdam agreed, donated a little bit of money for the preservation project, as well as the West German government did. And there was a bit of fundraising done. And the Anne Frank house actually opened its doors in May 1960. But Otto's vision was never that it was going to be like a memorial or backward-looking museum. It was going to be a place of education and coming together. And so he started having these student conferences for young people throughout Europe. In fact, a friend of mine who lives in Liverpool actually entered a competition in the Sunday Times to attend the very first student conference. It was a writing competition, and he won it. And off he went to Amsterdam as a 16-year-old, never been abroad before, never been on a plane.
Gosh.
But what's interesting about it was that Otto was adamant that some of the first students that he invited to attend these international conferences were German students. West German, obviously, because the East German students couldn't get out, but West German students, because he came from a family that was lived successfully in Frankfurt for 7 generations. The Frank family was so culturalized into Frankfurt society that when he was born, his father didn't just work in a bank in Frankfurt, he actually owned a bank, a small investment bank.
Right, yeah.
So that's how embedded into Frankfurt society they were. Otto Frank fought in the First World War. He fought so courageously that for his country, Germany, he was very patriotic, that by the end of the war, he'd received the Iron Cross for valor.
But isn't it amazing, Gillian, that so many who received the Iron Cross, and so many who had fought valiantly, Jewish men who had fought so valiantly on the side of Germany during World War I, were completely discarded and killed during World War II, because it didn't matter. It did not matter to the Nazis. They were still Jewish.
They were Jews above Germans. You see, they saw themselves as German Jews. Or Jewish Germans, but they were patriotic, as you say, but it didn't protect them because they were still seen as aliens, as to mention. Yeah. And
it's funny, I mean, you talk about the writing of the letters. I've been in contact for a long time with a lady, Dr. Helena Ganner, who wrote 4 letters to the witness of my childhood. Mm-hmm. She lives in San Francisco. She's in her 80s now, but when I was interviewing her, she just doesn't type, or she doesn't have a computer. Her husband deals with the computer for her. So I had to send, it was just so painful. I had to actually write out all the questions in by hand.
Yeah.
I had to go to the post office, which I haven't done in years, and I had to put a stamp on and post it off to her and wait at home for the letter to come with all my questions rewritten out, and her answers all rewritten. They came back in a big envelope about that size with love hearts and flowers and beautiful little stickers on it, and to my friend Mary, and she's been sending these since, with beautiful little personalized envelopes, and within envelopes and secret envelope on the top of them to look inside. And it's one of the greatest gifts I could ever have is her, because she was in hiding as an 11-year-old, and she was protected by a Polish prostitute, a Jewish doctor, a reverend mother in a convent, and the 4 letters are to her father, to her mother, to her sister Yanka, and to her stepmother Olga Alexandrovna, who was Russian, who she met after the war. Like Otto Frank, he survived, remarried, and she adored her stepmother.
Yes.
And but she never had any concept of being Jewish. They were atheists.
Yes.
And the reality was that they were Jewish by ethnicity.
Yes.
That was all that the Nazis needed.
Oh, absolutely. You know, one grandparent was enough to deem you Jewish.
Yeah, Michelin second degree.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, it just beggars belief. And but what brought you into Anne Frank? How did you get so immersed in Anne Frank firstly?
Well, totally serendipitous, Mary, because what was in the 1980s, I was very involved in what they called the Soviet Jewry campaign, where we were very active, primarily women, actually, a group of very active women, trying to get Jews out of Russia that were in great danger of being imprisoned on trumped up charges. They were considered sort of activists. All they wanted to do was leave and to be able to practice their own religion. And I always felt, there by the grace of God go I. And my children were small. I was doing this as a sort of like a voluntary campaign. By the mid-1980s, the campaign was on the wane because Gorbachev had come into power. And there was perestroika and glasnost, and people were being actually given exit visas and allowed to leave. So I was feeling a little bit bereft. And it was at that point in my life, 1988, when I received a call out of the blue from my very good friend and my rabbi, David Suddendorp. Now, he was Dutch, even though I was living in Bournemouth on the south coast at the time. And his father and Otto Frank had been great friends after the war in Amsterdam. And he phoned me up and he said, Gillian, I've heard that there is a new traveling exhibition that's just come to England from the Anne Frank House. And you know that my father and Otto Frank were very friendly. I'd love to bring it to Bournemouth, our town. And I said, oh, David, I'd love to help do that. And so we formed a committee, and like 9 months later, we worked on it very excitedly. The exhibition came to our town. It wasn't even housed in the town centre. It was in the university campus on the edge of town. But within 3 weeks, we had 10,000 visitors.
Wow.
And I thought, oh my goodness, I would just love to do something with this amazing exhibition and make sure that it carries on touring. So I got myself on a plane to Amsterdam and went to visit the Anne Frank House to meet the director, and convinced him that they really needed a British representative to keep this incredible exhibition on the road. And for my sins, I was appointed the British representative of the Anne Frank House. And then I came together with another friend of Otto Frank's, and also Eva Schloss, Otto's stepdaughter.
Yeah.
And together we formed the Anne Frank Trust in the UK, which was a partner organisation of the Anne Frank House, basically to keep the exhibition rolling, which we did. And it all started from my home in Dorset in 1990. And then when I retired 5 years ago, the trust, we moved into big offices in London in 2009, 2004. When I retired in 2016, we had 35 members of staff. So, we were taking exhibitions and educational programs to schools, to prisons, to communities all around the UK.
That's so fulfilling, life fulfilling.
Very much so.
Be able to bring, I suppose, possibility and hope to into prisons and into schools and that. And you know, school is so full of hope. Children are always, you know, there's always the hope that children are going to, when they come from school, the possibilities are endless for them, you know, for children. But for prisoners and that, who almost feel, what is there for me when I go out in the world? To bring Anne Frank as a story, and I know she was particularly, or the likes of Audrey Hepburn, and was fascinated by her her life.
Oh, very much so. I just before I'd like to touch on Audrey as well, because I was very, very honoured and privileged that she was actually, even when the organisation was run from my home, and we were very early days starting out, there was like 2 members of staff. Audrey agreed to become our patron, which was thrilling. But I'll come back to Audrey in a moment. What I want to touch on is what you were saying about hope.
Yeah.
Firstly, I want to talk about hope. Yes, I agree with you that young people do have hope, but where we have targeted our work, Mary, is in the areas of particular social and economic deprivation. Those areas of those poorer inner city areas, particularly in London, Manchester, etc. But actually in former, for example, post-industrial communities, like the former mining communities up in the northeast of England, where we go into areas, post-mining communities, where there are 3 generations of unemployment and there is very little hope. Now, how we instill hope and aspiration into young people is by giving them the responsibility to become our peer educators about Anne Frank. So we go into a school and we train a group of teenagers themselves to educate their peers, i.e. the other teenagers, about a teenager, Anne Frank. And it's a program that we've been using all over the world for the last 15 years or so, peer education, telling this particular story. And it's incredibly successful. And if you look on the Anne Frank Trust website, annefrank.org.uk, it's been academically evaluated, the long-term impact that it has, particularly on the peer educators that are trained to be the teachers, how it gives them not only it breaks down any attitudes of prejudice, discrimination, even if they're subconscious, but also gives them aspiration and hope. And I'm not just talking about in the UK, because the Anne Frank House itself had been doing these programs all around the world. And it's actually the premise of my book, which I can just give that a little plug, The Legacy of Anne Frank.
Legacy of Anne Frank.
And it tells a lot. I call this a handbook of hope, actually, because it tells how it's this whole idea of peer education in this particular story has changed young people's lives in places like the townships of South Africa, the favelas, the slums of Sao Paulo and Rio in Brazil, the street kids in Guatemala, children in India and Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka came through a 30-year civil war. In Northern Ireland, we did a lot of work bringing...
You were here in the south as well.
Oh, yes, very much so. We were in the south.
Yes. And you were out around Bunratty.
Yeah, well, we had the next...
Dirty Nellies.
Dirty Nellies, yes.
Dirty Nellies.
Castle, very much. I loved coming to Limerick. That was 1993, a long time before. We were working with Cooperation Ireland, actually, but also...
I actually had Cooperation Ireland coming on my show because I was at their event in Belfast. I was at the Global Peace Foundation event.
Yes.
And it was jointly run by Cooperation Ireland, Dr. Alan Largy and Barry Fennell. They head up Cooperation Ireland now.
Yes. Oh, I think this was. I mean, I was working with them nearly 30 years ago.
Yeah.
This is a new generation of leaders there, but it was a fantastic project. It was, and I mentioned to you that Dr. Brendan O'Regan was very much involved, and Dorothy Cantrell from the University of Limerick, and it was Cooperation North and Cooperation Ireland we worked with. But when we worked in the north, in Northern Ireland, we always made sure that it was an opportunity, a platform for Catholic and Protestant teenagers to come together to talk about the issues surrounding Anne's life in a non-controversial way. Because of the distance of the 70 years or so that we're looking at this story about a teenager, the young people can open up about their own deepest feelings and anxieties and concerns because of the distance.
It also dismantles this, in a sense, it also helps to dismantle this sense of otherness. Because when it's very difficult for children to understand, or anyone to understand, the impact of an atrocity such as the Holocaust, when you're looking at it through the lens of 6 million Jews, 5 million Gentiles. And I mean, you know, there's a priest in France, Father Dubois, and he's documented the Holocaust by bullets, and he's going around trying to find all the mass graves that have not been. So I mean, 6 million, 11 million is very conservative, because by the time all the mass graves are found, it could be double that, treble that. But it's very difficult for people to contextualize and to imagine what it's like to be when you're thinking in millions, but to bring it down to one child. One little girl who finds that she's going through puberty, she's going through all these changes, she's having problems with her mother, problems with her sister, she's in love with the little she's in love with the little boy, she's looking out that little bit of a window and she's thinking that the world out there that I never took any notice of before is the world that I would give anything to be out in now, and she's trapped. So for people in COVID, young people in COVID, and isolation and that, I think it's vitally important, that book, because it gives them an understanding of what it must have been like in some small way for one child.
Exactly. They can now identify with Anne Frank, you know, being isolated, being totally isolated, when she talks about wanting to go back to school and desperate to see her friends and worrying about her friends and all those issues that they're going through, that, you know, their emotional changes, their bodily changes, feeling that no one's taking them seriously, they're still being thought of as a child.
Missing their friends, not getting on with their, because when you're with people 24/7, every little detail about them starts to aggravate you.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. You ask my husband.
You might love them, but you just hate being around them for 24 hours, 7 days a week.
We're both lecturers, and we're both used to traveling and going off and saying bye-bye and going off, you know, for a few weeks. But the other resource that we have with Anne Frank, Mary, which is very unusual, is that as well as that we have her, we can get inside her mind through her words, we also have this astonishing resource of photographs of her growing up, because her father was a very, very keen amateur photographer. And so there is an unusual amount of photographs. He had a beloved Leica camera that his passion was photography, and his other passion was his two daughters. And fortunately, those survived, because before they went into hiding, Otto Frank sent the entire collection of photographs to his family in Switzerland. So we have this remarkable resource, and many of the photographs of Anne Frank, she looks very cool and she looks very modern. And so there are the two ways of really bringing this one person who, at the end of the day, was a statistic in the Holocaust, of really bringing her to life. And, you know, there are, as well, of course, as people like Eva Schloss, who we mentioned earlier, who remember her, who played with her, and other friends who actually survived and can describe her as a real person. So she really is, you know, a person who's really come to life visually through the photographs and verbally through everything she's wrote. So she really does live.
But as well as that, I mean, there's a video I saw there recently on YouTube of Anne looking out of the window at a wedding that was happening, and that it's particularly breathtaking, really, because to see somebody in a photograph, it's one-dimensional. To read their books, it's one-dimensional, but when you actually see the video of them, and she leaning there without a care in the world, oblivious apparently to what was to happen to her, and
shaking her head a little bit, flesh and blood human teenager,
flesh and blood human being, that the world feels they know, if only through her photographs, through her books. But when you see her looking out the window, it's quite scary to think that little girl looking out without a care in the world could have ended her life the way it did.
Yes, and also so frustrating that she could never know the impact that she had on the world. And it's whether it's someone like John F. Kennedy, who wrote in 1960, as early as that, how profoundly he'd been affected by reading Anne's diary. Nelson Mandela, who talked about when he opened the Anne Frank exhibition in Johannesburg in 1994, when he'd just become president, and he described reading Anne's diary before he went into Robben Island prison as a young man, and he actually had it smuggled in to the prison so that the prisoners could read this testament to the human spirit. And this little copy of her diary that Mandela smuggled in and encouraged the prisoners to read, literally fell to bits. It was so well read. And what he did, he asked the prisoners to copy it out by hand, page by page, in their cells by candlelight at night, so that the prisoners could continue to read it. And we don't know what happened to that little copy. The hand.
It would have been exceptional to have that, wouldn't it?
It's an incredible story. Now, you mentioned Audrey Hepburn a little bit earlier on.
Yeah.
Well, Eva and I were very privileged to meet Audrey Hepburn in 1991 when she was performing readings from Anne's diary at the Barbican in London in aid of UNICEF. And we went to her dressing room, and it was very poignant, Mary, because Eva said to Audrey, well, you know that my stepfather and my mother really wanted you to play Anne Frank in the movie, in the 1960 movie, The Diary of Anne Frank. And Audrey said, well, you know, Eva, why I couldn't do it. And she said, well, I assume you had filming commitments and maybe you thought you were a little bit old to play the role. And she said, no, it wasn't that. She said, it was basically when I read Anne's diary, it tore me apart because I was
She'd grown up in Holland.
Yes, she was exactly the same age in Arnhem, living in Arnhem, and her mother was in the Dutch resistance during the war. And Audrey herself was running errands very dangerously for the resistance herself. And she actually went into hiding. She came back from running an errand and saw Gestapo trucks outside their apartment. Yeah. And she thought they'd come to arrest her and her family. And so she ran and she hid in a cellar for 3 weeks. I don't know what she ate for that 3 weeks, but for the rest of her life, you know, she had that very sylph-like figure. Because she was starved, and basically the precursor
of the United Nations.
Exactly, yes, the precursor of the United Nations helped her. Yes, she was one of the first children helped by UNICEF.
UNICEF, yeah.
And that's why she devoted the rest of her life to UNICEF. But she said to Eva and I that it just tore her apart how closely. And when she read Anne's diary, she felt that Anne was going through everything that she was going through as she was transitioning from a child into an adolescent. And I managed to sort of jump in there and she said, is there anything I can do? And I said, yes, we've just started a new charity. Would you become our patron? I don't think she realized it was just myself and another part-time administrator running it from my home. And she agreed to become our patron, Mary. So you can imagine that her name writ large on our letterhead in those days.
You get nothing in life without asking.
My mantra, if you don't ask, you don't get. And so that was incredible honor to have Audrey Hepburn, who was so deeply.
You know, in retrospect, she would have been, had she actually taken that plunge, she would have been an exceptional Anne Frank in the role, because I would think that being able to draw from that sense of understanding, that sense of selfness that you could see in Anne Frank's story.
And even understanding what it was like to live in occupied Holland. Nobody
else would have been able to draw deeply from Anne Frank and understand Anne Frank like Audrey Hepburn would have.
Yes.
And even appearance-wise, they weren't, you know, it wasn't a stretch to have made her look like Anne.
No, absolutely. But there you are. She just felt she couldn't do it, but she gave, you know, in other ways through UNICEF. Remarkable woman. And it was only about 18 months after we met her that she passed away from stomach cancer, which was tragic. So young, so very young.
I'm just thinking here now. I could talk to you forever on Anne Frank, but you're a woman of many talents and many interests. Not least your book about bringing tea to England. That is a completely different segue.
Yes, well, it is. Yes.
Where did that passion come from?
Well, I've always loved afternoon tea. Who doesn't? But it dates back to.
I've always loved tea.
When I retired,
morning, noon, and night.
Yes. When I retired, I put myself forward to lecture on cruise ships. Because I was ready for something completely, you know, completely different trajectory in my career. And I wanted to lecture and I wanted to write the book, The Legacy of Anne Frank. And so when you lecture on cruise ships, very often there's a series of days that you're at sea and they ask their lecturers to give of lectures. So they said, well, we love your lecture on Anne Frank, but what else do you lecture on? So I thought very quickly, what am I really interested in, want to research? And I love our classic afternoon tea. And I'm always interested, Mary, I don't know if you are too, I'm sure you are, in the things that we take for granted in our life, but we never really think how it all started. And so I said, well, I do a lovely lecture on the social history of English afternoon tea. And so they said, well, that sounds really good. And you see, there was method to my madness, Mary, because on land, what happens is I give this lecture in the normal circumstances. I give this lecture in hotels, historic houses. I do it for family celebrations, and it always ends in a lovely afternoon tea. So part of the deal. So and so I've even done it for the Holocaust Survivors Society. I've done it for the Association of Jewish Refugees, and I do it for birthday celebrations. I've done it in Woburn Abbey, which is actually the home of afternoon tea, where the Duchess of Bedford invented the concept. So that's just one of my many sort of lectures. I also do one because I was very fortunate to attend the Oscar ceremony in Hollywood with Miep Heath, who was the helper of Anne Frank, and we walked down the red carpet together. And so I do another lecture on the history of the Oscars, which I'm doing for a cultural organization on the night the Oscars are announced this year. So I have quite a range of different lectures, which I enjoy. I did a course on Anne Frank for a Philadelphia-based cultural tours company last summer during lockdown. And that was looking at 5 different aspects of Anne's life. And I'm doing another one in a week or so for Viking cruises. They have a sort of like a lecture series on Viking TV, and they've asked me to do Amsterdam through Anne Frank's eyes, which I'm really looking forward to. So
I'm hoping. I've applied now for a Government of Ireland funding to do postdoc research on Hubert Butler, who was he was considered the Irish George Orwell. And he opposed the Catholic Church in this country's involvement in Croatia and with the Croatian Nazis hiding them in Ireland, and their refusal to allow 500 Jewish children into Ireland before, during, or after World War II. And so he went to Austria, to Vienna, and along with the Quakers, he hid 2 families in particular, smuggled them out, got them into Ireland and then to the Americas. But there's very little known about him, apart from his own writings and one PhD that was supervised by Professor Roy Foster in Oxford. But other than that, I want to focus on his time in Austria.
Yes.
So I'll know in March if I got the funding to do a documentary, a book, a documentary, and a series of lectures.
Wow. Yes.
So
I'll research that. Actually, sounds very interesting. Yeah.
Hubert Butler. He was Anglo-Irish. They were Anglo-Irish, and but fascinating man. But there's so much good in the world, but there is so much evil as well.
Yes. By the way, did you know I'm an honorary Irish citizen?
I didn't.
No, I was made so by none other than President Mary Robinson, because in 1993, Mary Robinson came and opened the Anne Frank exhibition in Dublin, in the Central Library there. And she spoke so eloquently about what Anne's diary meant to her as she was a teenager reading it growing up. Mm-hmm. Now, the following year, I was asked by the Anne Frank House to go and open the Anne Frank exhibition in South Africa, in Port Elizabeth. And my husband and I were staying in the hotel in Johannesburg, and it just coincided by sheer chance with Mandela's inauguration. So we arrived in the hotel and we had a note slip through our door an hour after we arrived saying, "We are sorry for the inconvenience to our guests, but we have 49 presidents and heads of state staying in this hotel for the inauguration next week." And guess what? We were sitting, my husband and I were sitting in the lobby, and who would walk through the lobby but Mary Robinson and her husband, Nicky. Mm-hmm. Of course, no one recognized her in South Africa, in Johannesburg. And I jumped up and tearing over to her, and I said,
you're what they say gas in this country. You're not backward in going forward.
That's right. There's a Yiddish expression, chutzpah.
Yeah, you've got chutzpah.
So I went tearing over to her and I said, "How lovely to see you." And we talked about the Anne Frank exhibition, the impact it had in Dublin. And then just as I was turning to leave, her aide said to me, "Oh, the president would love you to come and attend her reception tonight." And it was obviously for the Irish expats in South Africa. So there were a lot, so we went, and we were chatting to a lot of Irish business people and the nuns and the priests that had come out to South Africa. We're having a lovely time. And then we were called in to make a line. So they were all Irish expats. And then us. And so as President Robinson caught our eye in the line, and she said, "Oh, you two," she said, "I have made you honorary Irish citizens." Now, of course, it was probably just for that night to attend the reception. But in my book, Mary, I am
an honorary Irish
citizen until the day I die.
You've led a very, very charmed life, and you've met kings and queens and presidents and
and again, that's a lot through chutzpah.
and actresses, famous actresses. God, I would have loved to have met Audrey Hepburn. But such is life. I mean, she was an extraordinary person, not just, they say, I saw somebody put a post up one day and say, there isn't an actress or an actor in the world who has actually made an impact beyond their films and things like that. And I said, what about Audrey Hepburn? And then all the answers, absolutely. You can't deny that the woman was much more than an actress. She was an absolute humanitarian.
Oh, she totally was. In fact, there's a whole chapter about her in the book, actually. And actually, there's a chapter about, some of the people I've mentioned to you, Meep, the brave helper, the chapter about Otto and his vision, as well, of course, there's a chapter about Anne herself, fleshing out her character. But really, the impact of learning about Anne Frank in really some very surprising places around the world, and how it has literally changed young people's life for the better.
I was just paying my parking space there. It just bleeped to tell me my parking space was up. But when you were at the Oscars, you were part of a documentary on Anne, and the man who won, the director of it, made a lovely speech about Mies Geep.
Meep, yes. It was a lovely story. I had commissioned the film in 1994 because it was coming up to the 50th anniversary of the death of Anne Frank and the end of World War II. And I'd heard about this director because John Blair, very talented South African director, who had made a wonderful film on Oskar Schindler. And it was actually his documentary that Steven Spielberg referred to a lot when he was making Schindler's List.
Yeah.
And so I went to meet him. I was introduced to him. I went to meet him and I said, how do you feel about making a documentary about Anne Frank? And he said, well, I can't believe there's never been one. So I said, I can assure you.
I can't believe there's never been one either.
And so he went away and he researched and he called me. He said, you're absolutely right. There hasn't. And I would love to do it. So I took him to Amsterdam to meet the Anne Frank house director, who they got on like a house on fire. And he went back and he got the funding from Disney, from Steven Spielberg, and from the BBC, who agreed to show it as part of their flagship broadcasting to mark the 50th anniversary. And so he went away, he interviewed all these people in Amsterdam, in Poland, in Germany, many, many people who had known Anne Frank personally. Now, remember, this is getting on for nearly 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So, many of these people were still alive then, subsequently died, including me. And then the film was put up, nominated for an Emmy Award in America, and then, lo and behold, an Oscar. And he actually said to me, he called me, he said, look, I'd love you to come to the Oscar ceremony, because if it wasn't for you, this film wouldn't exist. And I said, well, much as I would love to come with you, John, and I would love to come to the Oscars, who wouldn't? The person you should take is Miep, because she really is the star of the film. And if you ever get a chance to see that documentary, it's 2 hours long. It's called Anne Frank Remembered. He was determined to make the definitive documentary. In fact, that 7 seconds of moving footage of Anne that you referred to was first shown in his documentary. He discovered it was hidden away in the Anne Frank House archives. And so he said, well, Miep's a very old lady. She won't want to fly all the way to Los Angeles. I said, well, just ask her. Well, it just so happened that she'd been invited by a school to come and speak to their pupils in Los Angeles and various other organizations. And so she was actually, by sheer chance, going to be in Los Angeles at that time of the Oscars.
Wow.
And so she said, yes, I can come. So he then phoned me up and he said, look, Miep's coming, but I'm determined to get you a ticket. And it wasn't until 3 days before the Oscar ceremony that he managed to secure my ticket. So I literally got on a plane the following day, went to stay.
Who did you wear?
Who did I wear? I think it was Miss Selfridge, probably. No one anyone's ever heard of. These days, it would have been Primark.
We have a place here called Dunn's, and
Dunn's. I love Dunn's.
St. Bernard's, and some people say San Bernardo.
San Bernard. Dunay. Yeah, Dunay. I love Dunn's stores. And
yeah.
And so we ended up, I went to stay with relatives that I'd never met before. And we ended up progressing down the red carpet to the Oscar ceremony in Hollywood with Miep Gies. Now, I sat somewhere in the audience, quite away from them. They sat, of course, in the front. And when the film won the Oscar, you could hear me screaming on the television.
All your dignity left you.
Yeah, no dignity.
No dignity whatsoever.
This little white-haired elderly lady, she was already in her 80s, up on the stage. Now you can imagine the people watching the Oscar ceremony from all around the world and those in the auditorium. They're used to these very glamorous Hollywood stars going up on the stage. And here was a very short, white-haired old lady going up on the stage. And John Blair said, ladies and gentlemen, in a city of celluloid heroes, please meet a real one. And then he introduced it as the helper of the Frank family. And you can imagine the whole auditorium erupted. So it was unforgettable, Mary. It was just the most unforgettable night. The privilege of going to the Oscars. And I actually spent a lot of time with Miep in the 90s when I was setting up the trust, and in the early 2000s. She died at age 100 in 2010. And she was remarkable. I have letters from her. I spent time actually in her apartment where she showed me articles, items from the hiding place, including a little typed menu that Anne typed on the typewriter because Miep and her husband Jan were spending one night hiding in the secret annex with the Frank family to mark their wedding anniversary, and they had a special dinner, and Anne typed an actual menu. She showed me a handwritten shopping list written by Mrs. Frank for her to go and get food, and she showed me a pair of high-heeled red shoes that Anne refers to in her diary, and she actually had them in her apartment. Now, of course,
I mean, you know, I mean, those items are just simply beyond price.
Absolutely, totally.
You know, I mean, those items are just a testament to so many things, a testament to strength of character, a testament to hate, testament to love, testament to hope, testament to determination to live.
Yes, yes,
and
yes.
all in objects that on their own represent very little importance. A piece of paper,
at the time,
a pair of shoes, but are profoundly important in the passage of time.
Yes, and also just to show that these people were real human beings.
Shoes is never more of a signal, and I think it's probably the one thing that affects people when they go to Auschwitz is all the shoes that are piled up, because when you look at shoes, you imagine the physical person inside them, and you see the children's shoes, and you imagine that children once wore those.
Yes,
and it brings the humanity.
And also with the adults' shoes, that those people actually chose that style of shoe. They chose that color.
And it also shows that, you know, in 1940s, 1939, 40, 45, red shoes, that a little girl would actually choose red shoes, shows a lot about her character as well, because red is a power color.
Yes.
It's also it's not a shy and retiring color.
Yeah, it's a statement. Actually, the red shoes actually belong to Miep, and she took them in for Anne to clomp around. You know how all children clomp around in their mother's high-heeled shoes. They were Miep's shoes, but Anne had actually, I touched them. You can imagine, Mary, I touched them. These were shoes that Anne had actually worn. So it was quite profound. But yeah, and Miep was a remarkable woman, remarkable.
I think anyone that will actually put themselves in that profound danger. I found out during my master's, I haven't actually found out exactly where it is, but my great-great-grandmother was, Jacob was her surname. And my family believed that she was Jewish, had married out of her faith. She married a Protestant in Wales, and the line then became Protestant, except for me. And you know, you look and you read about things like Michelin second degrees, and you realize that the Nazis just, they had, you know, if you were fortunate enough not to look in their eyes, if you were fortunate enough to have the perfect bone structure that they considered to be Aryan, even if you were born into a Jewish household, you were kidnapped for the Lebensborn programs and brought up as Aryan or brought up as German, and many found out afterwards they were actually Jewish. and people like me who had even an ounce of, if you know, Jewish blood would have been considered Michelin second degrees or third degree in that. And you think the insanity of it all. I interviewed a lady the other day. She lives in Dublin, and she found out that she was a Lebensborn, that her mother was Swedish, and had her for a German. Now she thinks he was a foot soldier, from what they were told. And she's in her 70s now, and she only found out 5 years ago who her mother really was, because she was adopted twice, and that she found out that her mother had been tortured, and that they were measured, all the measurements that was done to them, size of their head, their bone structure, everything, to see if they conformed with the Nazis' ideals of a perfect Aryan race. And it's scary to think that people would sit down and think out these and reduce humanity to mere centimeters.
Absolutely. And as we said before, you know, educated people.
Educated people, I mean, absolutely. You know, you think if it happened with people who weren't educated, you'd say, oh, well, they were ignorant, or they were, and there were many. I mean, you know, Tommy Reichenthal talks about the likes of Hilda Michnier or Hilda Lisievich, who was one of the camp guards in Bergen-Belsen. And he found her years later, and he went to Bergen-Belsen. He went to meet her with an Irish crew, a film crew, and she wouldn't speak to him in the end and he thought that she would speak to him. But she was one of the camp guards in Bergen-Belsen, and they were ignorant. She had come uneducated, had come from farms and that, and had been given a job, given a uniform, given makeup, lipstick, nail varnish, and this sense of omnipotence. But many of them, the likes of Himmler and Göring and Eichmann and Mengele, were all educated, highly educated people who just abdicated all sense of humanity.
Yes, yes. Absolutely.
And did it willingly.
Yes. Oh, yes, yes. And they just loved the sense of power, and that they felt that they were on a divine course, you know, to make, and in their view, they were making the world a better place. It's for us, it's incomprehensible what was going on.
And her story is a testament, and is one for humanity, for eternity, really. And Gillian, what can I say? Thank you so very much.
It's been very enjoyable. It's been lovely to talk to you. I feel now that you're an old friend, Mary.
Me too.
If I just mention, if anyone sees this that is interested, I do give lectures on Anne Frank, and of course afternoon tea as well, but Anne Frank anywhere in the world via Zoom.
I'll put that at the end of the interview, that you're available to give lectures on it.
Yes.
And should I call you Lady Gillian?
I think not. But it's been great fun seeing you and your lovely ducks.
Oh, my lovely ducks. It's all smoke and mirrors. Thank you, Gillian.
And it's been lovely. It's been very, very nice speaking to you, Mary.
Keep in contact.
And we will keep very much in contact.
Please.
And my book's available from Amazon, and it's
I'll put that up as well.
Book of Hope.
Book of Hope, absolutely. Thank you. God bless.
Bye-bye.
Shalom.